Imagine a crowded street. Suddenly, someone collapses, screaming in terror. Another person follows suit, then another. And before you know it, the entire town is in chaos, crying, panicking, convinced the end is near. This is what mass psychosis looks like. Also referred to as mass hysteria or collective hysteria, mass psychosis occurs when a large group of people experience a shared delusion, irrational fear, or panic, often fueled by rumors, misinformation, or a highly emotional event. In this state, people's ability to think critically can be impaired, and they may act in ways that are extreme, irrational, or out of character. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, 1921, Freud noted that groups foster identification with a leader and diminish personal responsibility, leading to unity, but also irrational and instinct-driven behavior. Al-Ghazali, one of the most influential Islamic philosophers and theologians, wrote extensively on psychology. He warned against being led astray by delusion, false ideas, or misinformation. He discussed how individuals, especially when influenced by corrupt or misguided leaders, can fall into states of mass confusion and irrationality. Today we'll dive into the eerie phenomenon of mass hysteria, moments in history when communities collectively lost control of their minds and their actions. The dancing plague of 1518, Strasbourg, France. In the summer of 1518, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began dancing. Not a joyous jig, not a festival celebration, just frantic, unrelenting movement. People initially laughed or watched curiously, but as hours turned to days, the scene grew disturbing. Her face showed no signs of pleasure, only exhaustion and pain. Within a week, dozens had joined her, swaying, spinning, and stomping their feet as if possessed. By the end of the month, more than 400 people were dancing uncontrollably. Physicians of the time, perplexed, blamed hot blood, an imbalance in bodily humors. Their prescription? Let the dancers exhaust the madness by continuing. A stage was erected, musicians were hired, and the dancing went on. But instead of curing the problem, it worsened. People collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some reportedly died of heart attacks or strokes. While modern theories suggest ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus found in bread, or collective stress caused by famine and disease, the exact cause remains a mystery. What we know for sure is this: an entire city danced itself to death. The Salem witch trials, 1692, Massachusetts. Salem, Massachusetts was a small Puritan settlement grappling with fear of the devil, of Indian raids, and of the unknown. In the winter of 1692, a group of young girls began exhibiting strange symptoms. They convulsed, screamed, barked like dogs, and claimed to see ghostly figures tormenting them. The town, steeped in religious fervor, saw this as evidence of witchcraft. Under pressure, the girls accused local women of being witches. This set off a chain reaction: arrests, interrogations, and confessions, often forced. Hysteria gripped the town as people turned on one another, accusing neighbors, friends, and even family members of witchcraft. Over 200 were accused, 19 were hanged, and one man was pressed to death with heavy stones. Historians believe mass hysteria, compounded by religious zeal, local rivalries, and even ergot poisoning, fueled the paranoia. The Salem witch trials remain one of history's most tragic examples of collective fear spiraling into violence. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic, 1962, Tanzania. In a small Tanzanian village, laughter spread like wildfire. But this wasn't joy. It was a strange, uncontrollable affliction. It began at a girls' boarding school, where a few students started laughing. It soon engulfed the entire school, leaving students unable to focus or function. Teachers, overwhelmed, shut the school down, but the laughter didn't stop. When the girls returned to their villages, the epidemic spread. Families, neighbors, and even entire communities began laughing uncontrollably, sometimes for hours or even days. Over 1,000 people across multiple villages were affected. Symptoms included fainting, crying, and difficulty breathing. Authorities were baffled. There was no physical disease to explain it. Psychologists suggest it was a stress response, triggered by cultural and societal pressures. The meowing nuns of France, 15th century. In a convent tucked away in France, a nun began to meow. At first, it was dismissed as odd behavior, but then others joined in. Soon, the entire convent was filled with the sound of rhythmic, synchronized meowing. What started as a strange quirk quickly became a full-blown crisis. The meowing lasted for weeks, with nuns meowing at specific times of the day in unison. The local villagers, horrified, believed the nuns were possessed by spirits or cursed. Authorities eventually intervened, bringing soldiers to threaten punishment. The meowing abruptly stopped. Modern scholars attribute this to extreme stress and isolation. Life in a convent was rigid, emotionally repressive, and lonely. In this environment, one person's outburst could trigger a domino effect, allowing the nuns to express their pent-up frustrations in a socially permissible yet bizarre way. The Nazi Germany. This is an example of a mass psychosis orchestrated by a charismatic leader. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was reeling from economic ruin, humiliation, and a fractured identity. Into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler, a man who understood the power of mass psychosis. He didn't just offer solutions, he offered a vision that tapped into people's deepest fears and desires. Hitler's method was simple but effective. Manipulate emotions, prey on the scapegoats, and create an us versus them mentality. The Jews, communists, and anyone deemed a threat were painted as enemies of the state, responsible for Germany's suffering. His speeches were electrifying, and his message, simple and direct, spread like wildfire. Propaganda posters, films, and rallies served as tools to keep the masses in line, constantly reinforcing the idea that the German people were superior and that their struggle for survival justified horrific actions. It didn't matter that the logic was warped or the evidence weak, people were caught up in the narrative. The Nuremberg rallies, grand theatrical events filled with chants, symbols, and fierce nationalism, became rituals of emotional release. It was an all-consuming psychosis where rational thinking gave way to blind loyalty, and mass murder was justified by the belief in the greater good. In this fevered collective mentality, individuals were willing to sacrifice their humanity. The German people were swept up in an ideological delusion, believing they were part of something historic and noble. The War of the Worlds broadcast panic, 1938 USA. In 1938, millions of Americans tuned into a radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, a fictional story about a Martian invasion. But many listeners missed the introduction, clarifying it was a dramatization. What followed was chaos. The realistic format, featuring fake news bulletins and urgent reports, convinced listeners that aliens had landed in New Jersey and were annihilating towns. Panic erupted. People fled their homes, clogged highways, and hid in basements. Some armed themselves, ready to defend against extraterrestrials. While the extent of the panic has been debated, this event demonstrated how easily fear can spread when fueled by realistic media and societal anxiety. It was a stark warning of the power of misinformation, a lesson that resonates even today. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, 1944, USA. In the small town of Mattoon, Illinois, a strange story gripped the residents. People reported waking up to a sickly sweet smell, followed by nausea, paralysis, or dizziness. They claimed an unseen assailant was releasing gas into their homes. Panic spread as more reports came in. Women and children were particularly affected, and the media dubbed the perpetrator the Mad Gasser. Despite police investigations, no physical evidence or suspects were ever found. Psychologists later suggested mass hysteria caused by wartime anxiety. The residents, living in fear of chemical attacks during World War II, likely imagined the symptoms. But at the time, the terror was real, leaving a lasting imprint on the town's history. From dancing to death to laughing uncontrollably, these stories show how collective fear and stress can manifest in the most bizarre ways. Mass hysteria reveals a disturbing truth. As social beings, our minds are deeply influenced by the fears of those around us. So the next time you hear of an unexplained panic, ask yourself, how much of it is real, and how much is the mind playing tricks?